Today, I and Brad Roberts joined some kind of talk about nuclear strategy. The title is China's Emergence as a second nuclear peer, Implications for Nuclear Deterrence Strategy. This is a kind of follow-up talks of last December's one, which also include myself and Mr. Roberts and Mr. Murano, Hudson Institute, and Mr. Akiyama, University of Hitotsubashi. And this time, at that time, that was a kind of book rolling out events of Mr. Roberts' book, which the name is A Case for United States Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century. That was translated into Japanese at that time. And 4 months has passed. There is another nuclear publication about nuclear issues. That is these things. This is I'm sorry, this is not for Japanese, not in Japanese. This is an English one, and the title is just as this talk, China's Emergence as a second nuclear peer, and this is a kind of product of the study group, which hosted by Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And the member includes Mr. Roberts and Ellen Ban, who was a successor of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear and missile defense issues, following Mr. Roberts. And Robert Sufer, he also was assigned at that position at that era of Donald Trump. Or the Elbridge Colby, which is very famous strategist, who also joined the SPF's online talk, and John Warden, which is a rising younger generation nuclear strategist. So, and ending myself. So this is a kind of very well-known strategist product, which had very lively debate. And I want to, and the timing of this report is just designed after the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Strategic Posture Review Commission, which is organized by U.S. Congress. So this report is to give some impacts on American nuclear strategic debate. And I want to introduce Mr. Roberts, who was again the Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear and missile defense issues at the Obama administration. So, and I would ask you to have some summary of this report.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation and for leading it today. And thank you to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for creating this opportunity as well. And I'm pleased to be able to give a little overview of the report and a bit of background first, though. The background is that from a global perspective, we are passing from one chapter of nuclear history into another. The chapter that we're leaving is the chapter that began when the Cold War ended. When the Cold War ended, a great many things became possible in U.S. nuclear strategy and posture. We changed the number of weapons, we greatly reduced their number, we reduced the role of nuclear weapons, we pulled back from the deployment of nuclear weapons in Asia, arms control flourished, and we didn't worry much about the future. And that chapter has come to a close. It began to close a decade or more ago. Certainly when Russia invaded Crimea, we had a large wake-up call. But in today's security environment, there are many changes underway that are going to have big implications for U.S. military strategy, defense strategy, deterrence strategy, nuclear strategy. And one of the most important changes in the security environment is China's nuclear breakout. When I started working on the China nuclear topic in the mid-1990s, China was an afterthought for anybody thinking about nuclear problems because it was a country with approximately 20 weapons that could reach the United States. It's well on its way to being a country with 1,500 or more weapons capable of reaching the United States. And this, of course, captures American attention. But China's emergence as a second nuclear peer, and a peer is a precise word, but it means a country of roughly equal power, and in this case, nuclear potential, to that of the United States. And we are entering a period when the United States will now have two nuclear peer adversaries. This is new. This is different. And this was the focus of this study group. We discovered as a study group that we had different ideas about the problem presented by China's emergence as a second nuclear peer. Some in the group were very focused on the 2035 problem, when China is predicted to have 1,500 or more nuclear weapons available to it. Some were attracted to the nearer term problem. As you know, there were media reports a year ago, 2 years ago now, of China's secret construction program of 300 additional missile silos. And that construction program is coming to conclusion. And China has many missiles and some nuclear weapons to put in these silos. And so some people were more focused on this sort of 2025 problem as opposed to the 2035 problem. And the body of the report works through analysis and recommendations of each of these two problems and offers some pathways forward. And we're going to discuss elements of that in more detail. Before turning to that, though, where we began the substance of our analysis was on the implications of this new problem for U.S. nuclear deterrence strategy. And to start that discussion, you have to understand what nuclear deterrence strategy is. We described it as having three elements. There is, first of all, a general deterrence strategy. And general deterrence strategy is built around the idea that if you want to shape an enemy's calculus of his courses of action, you have to affect his calculus of the benefits, costs, and risks of different courses of action. And deterrence involves raising the expected costs to the adversary, reducing the expected benefits, and increasing the risk. Nuclear deterrence strategy, as opposed to general deterrence strategy, involves posing nuclear threats to an adversary's most vital interests in the extreme circumstances that adversary might create by employing nuclear weapons or other kinds of strategic attacks. And the essence of U.S. nuclear strategy is flexible response, being able to respond to particular nuclear provocations by adversaries in a calculated but limited way. The third element of strategy, so the first is a general deterrence strategy, the second is a nuclear deterrence strategy. The third element is nuclear employment strategy. So we say certain things in order to deter, but if deterrence fails, the instructions from the American president are to prepare for the possibility of employing nuclear weapons to terminate a war as quickly as possible at the lowest level of damage while achieving U.S. and allied political objectives. That may not involve actually doing everything you threaten to do in your deterrence strategy. Our conclusion as a working group was that the two-peer problem raises no fundamental question about any of these three elements of our strategy. that yes, it's an important new problem. It's a unique problem in the history of U.S. nuclear strategy, but it is not a fundamental challenge to any of the elements of nuclear deterrence strategy. Now, one area where we had a lot of debate on that was as it relates to counterforce, but we will come back to that. Sugio, let me turn it back to you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you for summarizing our reports and show the basic findings on that. And about the basic thoughts of nuclear deterrence will not be changed. But as Mr. Roberts said, the environment is fundamentally maybe changes. We talked about the nuclear deterrence issue more than 15 years, I guess. And for 15 years ago, some of the American people say we should reduce ICBM more. New START Treaty determines 550 warheads as deployed warheads. But at the time of 2013, President Obama made a Berlin speech saying we should reduce strategic nuclear weapon more. I mean, that 1/3 reduction is possible. So that means about 1,000. And at that period, I said, if U.S. reduce the size of nuclear warhead below 1,000, that could give a huge incentive for China to go to sprint parity. And at that time, I was perceived as nuclear hawkish people, I believe. But 15 years has passed. Even my thought was too optimistic.
Right.
Now China is on the way to go sprint to the parity. So in this point, I would ask, for the report drafting process, we have very intensive debates, about once or 2 weeks, I guess, and 3 a.m. in Japan, and much more convenient time for the United States. And one of the very big debate I remember was the size of U.S. strategic nuclear forces, or in other words, that is hedging. Hedging is in nuclear world. Hedging means to prepare some other bad scenarios, and to retain some warheads in non-deployed status. And if some bad case comes through, that warheads coming back to the delivery vehicle or missile. So this is the meaning of the hedge in nuclear deterrence world. And the hedge, now we are facing the very big, very bad scenario. I mean, second nuclear peer means China will have almost the same size of number of Russia. So China will face two nuclear superpowers. So in some sense, U.S. may need to increase the number of deployed warhead. So how do you see that issue through? That was we debated, and
right.
How do you see these issues more?
Right. Mm-hmm. So, just to add a point about hedge strategy, hedging is the part of the posture that has to do with the future. And we used to say 15 years ago that we lived in a changing, and unpredictable world. Mm-hmm. Now we say we predict a further erosion of the security environment. And hedging is about being prepared for a future need, a future decision by a future president or someone to adapt the nuclear posture so that deterrence remains effective in the new context. And what we've recommended in the report is that the existing hedge be implemented? Because as you said, the problem of China's nuclear breakout is exactly what one of the scenarios we were worried about. If you then implement some part of the hedge, you have to reset the hedge. And do you simply build more non-deployed weapons that you could put into the force, or do you do something different? And we in the report argued for doing something different.
Yeah.
For instead of building more nuclear weapons, creating the capability and capacity to do so, if there's a future need to do so. But this comes back to one of the points, another point of dispute in the study group. Is China sprinting to parity, meaning to have the same number of nuclear weapons as the United States and Russia? Or is it just sprinting? And on the one hand, there's some evidence that they just think of having enough as measured in being a modern military power, similar to other modern military powers. But they haven't expressed a political commitment to a particular cap. And President Xi Jinping has said he's offered another vision, which is that China will be in 2049 at the center of the world stage in the dominant position, quote unquote. And that doesn't sound like nuclear parity to me. I hope that China stops building new missile silos when it completes the current set, but I worry that it's just going to continue to go on and grow. Now, in the Cold War, so you noted that we have 1,550 deployed weapons today, and that's of a total of about 4,000, many of which are not serviceable. We had 35,000 in the Cold War. And we did in the study group have a discussion of, well, what if Russia and China both continue to produce a lot of new nuclear weapons over the coming decade? Are we going to race to keep even with them, or to try to get ahead of them? And are we willing to go back to 35,000? And I think this is a question we couldn't resolve as a study group.
So sometimes this thing is overlooked by Japanese side. That is, U.S. nuclear strategy or nuclear force is founded, is established on the nuclear weapon complex. Nuclear weapon complex is a nuclear industry to produce to manufacture the warheads or maintain the warheads. And back to the 2002, I guess, Bush administration's NPR says we have new triad, which includes the nuclear and the conventional, nuclear and the non-nuclear strike force. First pillar. The second pillar is missile defense. Third pillar is nuclear weapon complex, and connected to the nuclear command and control. And so that time, even 25 years ago, about 20 years ago, the importance of nuclear weapon complex was realized, and that was included in NPR. I believe that is the classified version. But still, one of the take from my participation in the project was, every NPR emphasizes the importance of nuclear weapon complex,
Right.
But the problem continues. I remember the one recommendation saying that's a long-term issue.
Right.
So, and especially I didn't realize some kind of the limitations, the production capability of new warheads. Of course, that's not necessarily surprising thing because U.S. has not produced a large number of new warheads. That's why you may not have a requirement, but now you have a requirement.
Right.
So how do you see the future of that issue? If it's a hedging, meaning more than upload, that means to produce a new design, new warheads,
Right.
then that could be the issue. So,
Right. So yes, the United States has not produced a new nuclear weapon since 1990. And every weapon that it produced was produced on the assumption that it would be retired within 20 to 25 years. So every U.S. nuclear weapon is beyond the original intended lifetime. And let's recall that the weapons themselves are the newer part of the deterrent because the delivery systems are much older. So the production complex is also fairly aged. And the work of the laboratories is heavily consumed with simply extending the life of the existing warheads. And that's not a robust hedge against the kind of world we're moving into. There will be improvements to the weapons complex in the next few years as a result of the life extension programs. And we had a debate in the preparation of this report, as you will recall, about do we emphasize an infrastructure that's capable of producing a lot, or do we emphasize an infrastructure that's capable of producing a few new? And we put the priority in the report on a few new, arguing that in the next decade, Russia and China are probably unlikely to go seek an arms race to build up many new weapons that we would have to compete with, but they're likely to field some new ones that are going to raise questions about whether we need some new ones as well.
So how do you think with a question, with a new one?
Whether we need new ones? My principal concern is that the old ones work. Will we need new ones? Probably. And let me give an example of why that might be so. So we have nuclear warheads that sit atop ballistic missiles that go in on a very direct ballistic trajectory to their target. Now, Russia has modernized its missile defenses, which are equipped with nuclear weapons. And we saw in today's newspaper that China successfully conducted a test of a missile defense system without a nuclear warhead on top. And thus, weapons that are ballistically delivered may not reach their target. Thus, the threat to attack is not credible. Thus, deterrence doesn't work. So we may need delivery systems or warheads that can maneuver around the defenses to get to their target. And then deterrence will be credible again. But that maneuvering at very high speeds puts tremendous pressures onto the warhead. And we would want to be sure that the warhead would work under those kinds of pressures. And that's an example of a possible future capability we might want to have.
I see. So, I mean, strategy change issue for the something to do with hedging issue, that is future arms control. I mean, you said the size issue and you said the quality of the weapon system issue. And now we are going to have U.S. deployed warhead would continue to be the 1550 even with Russian declaration of the non-compliance to New START. And Russia also said they have no intention to increase the size of their nuclear warheads, nuclear arsenal, while they would not accept the inspection and verification.
Right.
So at least looking at the official statement, both countries has no serious intention to increase the nuclear size of the nuclear arsenal.
Right.
Even at the era of non-compliance of New START treaty era.
Right.
And but China is coming. It could be, as you said, 2035 problem, they may have 1,500 warheads, and they may seek more than beyond the parity size of the warhead. So, how do you think? The current New START treaty will be expired in 2026. At first, can you? This is very huge. This is a huge. This attracts huge attention in Japan. So, do you think the New START treaty will be continued, or we may have the similar nuclear arms control treaty after 2026, or do we? Or will the New START treaty could be died before 2026? So, which do you think, and what kind of world comes after that?
So my guess is that when the New START treaty expires, we will have a period without arms control. I think that's likely. I think President Putin's calculus is that a secure America that feels that it's in a stable environment is also an America that's dangerous to Russia because we're confident in our use of power. So he's interested in keeping us in an unstable situation. And I think this is very much President Xi's calculus as well. I don't want to say there's zero possibility because there are some important Russian interests in having arms control, even if imperfect from their perspective. There are certainly strong Western interests. But I think we and the Russians have at least one area of common interest, which is ensuring that China is a part of the arms control regime sooner rather than later. This was already clear in 2010 when we were thinking about New START, that this was a shared interest. China clearly sees arms control as a trap and a way to break its lack of transparency, and thus they believe it would erode their deterrent and thus is not in their interest. So I consider an arms control arrangement after New START ends possible, but not likely. For some period of time. How long? An interregnum? Well, and it depends on what kind of world comes, as you rightly asked. A period I think back to the early Cold War for analogies. We had a big arms race in the 1950s and 60s, and two crises in Berlin and Cuba that scared Washington and Moscow. And the arms race also came to a point where neither side perceived much benefit in continuing to race because no new advantage was being gained. Those conditions clearly don't exist today with Moscow or Beijing. And thus it may take a decade or two of a fairly competitive nuclear environment to bring them back to the negotiating table. It's possible that will pass more quickly. It's possible that some crisis may occur earlier rather than later that would persuade decision makers to come back to an arms control arrangement. I'm not particularly motivated by the concern that there will be a big arms race when New START ends. I think China's not racing anybody. It's building to the Xi vision of being at the center of the world stage in the dominant position, whatever that means. I don't think President Putin is in a position to compete in an arms race in the nuclear domain with the United States. And one last point, which is a bit of a tangent to this discussion, but when we talk about the overall nuclear balance, as you know, Sugio, we tend to focus on the numbers of strategic weapons that can cross oceans to touch each other's countries. We shouldn't forget the number of theater weapons. And the United States has few weapons deployed in support of its extended deterrence commitments. Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons in Europe, and China has created a missile force in the region that's capable of delivering hundreds of nuclear weapons. It's not clear it has those weapons yet, but they're coming. So we can think about strategic stability at the strategic level, but we also need to account for the regional nuclear balance.
Correct. So, as Brad said, the size of arsenal of theater nuclear force for Russia and China would have very decisive impact in the theater level strategic stability. And also, US, Russia, and China has a very asymmetrical geographical situation. So the impact is different. Chinese theater nuclear force, which range includes more than 1,000 kilometer range of missiles, that 2,000 kilometer missiles could launch very large-scale counter-force as a counter-value strike against regional U.S. allies or regional countries. But their theater nuclear force cannot hold U.S. homeland at risk.
Right.
And also, Russian theater nuclear force can hold Eastern Europe at risk, but the U.S. continent or Western Europe countries would be out of the range of that forces. And if U.S. has theater nuclear force, I mean the maritime theater nuclear force, then U.S. maritime theater nuclear force can hold Chinese mainland and also Russian mainland at risk. And not just mainland, especially in case of China, that nuclear force could strike Chinese strategic nuclear force, which can reach the U.S. mainland. So in a sense, the American maritime theater nuclear force can have the strategic impact. I mean, the similar impact to the strategic nuclear force.
Right.
Yeah. So this will complicate the arms control issues. The reports include the proposal. I believe that's a Frank Miller's one. That is, one of the possible arms control is setting the big ceiling. I believe that is 3,500, as you mentioned, right. And the signatory of that regime can deploy any range of missiles or any range of missiles, any kinds of nuclear warheads, within this number. So this is, I think, a very interesting idea, and I think it's a good way to start the debate, while it may have some production issues. Also, I think we should not underestimate the potential strategic impact or utilities of U.S. maritime theater nuclear force. And that's why I should not use the words of big fan, but I'm endorsing the importance of SRICOM. And SRICOM means a sea-launched cruise missile or submarine-launched cruise missile, nuclear. And but that was canceled by this administration, while the Congress made some lifeline, some life-saving money for that program. And to be honest, this was a very big debate of the report drafting team at the very final moment.
Right.
So could you summarize what we discussed? And could I have your thoughts on that?
Well, we discussed the context here was the need to strengthen extended nuclear deterrence, which is a process that's underway with the modernization of the dual-capable fighter bomber and the associated bomb that goes with it. These are capabilities that are part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements and are forward deployed in Europe. We're also modernizing the bomber force, which will have a role in theater nuclear deterrence. But the discussion in the group was what more is needed. We all agreed, Democrats, Republicans, Japanese, Poles, that additional capabilities are needed for extended nuclear deterrence. We don't have enough for this kind of environment with two nuclear pairs and a nuclear-armed North Korea and the possibility of a nuclear-armed Iran around the corner. So more is needed, modern is needed, something different is needed. When the Cold War ended, the United States had 22 different types of nuclear weapons. It now has 4. That gives us some variety. By one unofficial count, the Russians have 31 different types in Europe.
In Europe?
In Europe. Now, the group doesn't argue for America to have 31 types. But the discussion was, would a sea-launched cruise missile, submarine-launched cruise missile, add useful diversity and flexibility and strengthen our ability to meet the large threats at the regional level from Russia and China. And we all agreed on Democrats and Republicans on SLICM-N as useful for developing and producing and stockpiling. We disagreed on whether it should be deployed at this time. And the disagreement was about if you're going to deploy a nuclear cruise missile onto an attack submarine, you have to take something off of the attack submarine to do that. And what you would have to take off are non-nuclear cruise missiles, which are the front line of our deterrent against China in the maritime environment. So there was an argument that it would actually weaken our overall deterrence posture at a time when the attack submarine force is under a lot of other pressures. But we have a unanimous recommendation in favor of development, production, and stockpiling of the sea-launched cruise missile. And this puts us at odds with the Biden administration.
Yeah. So for theater nuclear forces, U.S. has 3 options. Mainly, there could be more, but main option would be 3. The first one is forward deployment of dual-capable aircraft. Dual-capable means, the aircraft which can conduct a mission for nuclear strike and conventional strike. And that is F-16 or F-15, but now changing to F-35. And the problem of this option is considering the range of F-35, the fighter aircraft need to be deployed within the range of Chinese or North Korean missiles. So once the nuclear-tipped aircraft deployed in that range, that could be a very lucrative target for Chinese side or North Korea. So that is very, risk-taking decision-making. And they may not provide robust deterrence under anti-access area denial environment. The second option is long-range LRSO, long-range cruise missile from the strategic bombers, and which flies mainly from U.S. mainland. The issue is it takes a long time, more than 10 hours, and maybe close to 20 hours, and the payload is actually limited. And the third option is, which we discussed, was maritime option, that is mainly submarine-launched cruise missile. Before Obama administration, at the time of the Cold War, that weapon was, nuclear-tipped Tomahawk was deployed, but that was removed from ship after the end of the Cold War, and that missile was destroyed at the time of Obama administration. And Trump administration decided to recreate the kind of nuclear-tipped submarine-based cruise missiles, but now that is under the debate. So this is the background of the theater nuclear issues, and the reason why I endorse the importance of SRICOM and submarine-based cruise missile is which provides a very robust deterrent even under anti-access area denial situation, because it operates underwater, while it requires, if the nuclear-tipped missile is deployed, the conventional armed missile need to be removed. Not 100%, but that would affect the capability for conventional strike. So that's the reason why there exists some debates. And about the theater deterrent, the big topic for this report again is how do we strengthen the credibility of extended deterrence. The extended deterrence is actually a triangle issue. So one issue is how to deter the potential challenger. And from U.S. perspective, the other issue is how to reassure allies. The very famous words in this world, this community, is that the name is Healy theorem. Healy was United Kingdom Defense Minister in the 1960s. He said, to deter Russians, 5% credibility is enough. But to reassure Europeans, you need 95% credibility. So this is still true in the situation. If the 5% credibility could be enough to deter Chinese people, I'm not sure, but could be. But to be reassured, to reassure Japanese, we need, I think I want to have more than 95% credibility. So the issue is how do we maintain, or how do we create some mechanism to maintain the 95%, at least 95% credibility. So Brad made very good framework to discuss these issues, which actually discussed that issue in December workshop, but I want to revisit that. So how could you say your software solution, hardware solution again?
Sure. Extended deterrence. The United States extends deterrence to its allies with a mix of hardware and software. And our debates about what to do in this area very often focus on the hardware and ignore the software. The hardware side are the weapon systems Sugio described, and the associated pilots and training and exercises. The software side is a reference to the things our leaders say about our commitments to each other and to the employment of nuclear weapons. So declaratory policy is the formal term. The software side also includes the consultative processes by which the United States consults with its allies before making a decision about whether or not to employ nuclear weapons. In a NATO context, we have agreed rules of nuclear consultation in crisis. We have agreed principles of nuclear deterrence. We have a designated conference room where the discussion would occur. And so the allies who want to have a seat at the table to ensure that when the president makes such a decision, it's done with their input, they know how that will work. But in the U.S., Japan, and U.S. ROK relationships, there are no agreed principles. There is no conference table. There's no agreed conference room. And thus, there's a need for improved consultative mechanisms.
Yep. So, hardware side is really, the problem for within the United States, because, that is developed and maintained by American taxpayers. So especially what we want to make sure is the software side. And actually for the process to make this report, that was one of the topic to be discussed. I emphasizes the importance of combined planning for nuclear missions. And because, for the Allies' perspective, the most effective measure to be reassured is to share the planning and is to prepare to how to execute that planning. That's why both in US-Japan Alliance and US-ROK Alliance has a shared planning process of the conventional defense and annual or biannual exercise to check whether we can smoothly execute the planning. And so for conventional realm, we do that. Why we don't have that process in nuclear, which is more important for the national survival? So that's the point. In case of NATO, at least a nuclear sharing country has a shared planning for that weapon, the specific weapons, and conduct annual exercise for that. And recently, the country which is not a member of a nuclear sharing arrangement is joining that exercise. And they can be shared some portion of the planning. So that's a big, vacuum in the alliances in Asia Pacific, not just US-Japan Alliance, US-ROK Alliance also too. So that's the reason why I emphasized the necessity to even a part of the nuclear planning process. Ideal case, why don't we have a combined planning cell in strategic command? So that is what I personally emphasize at the process of the debate. But some other argument exists. The only person who decides the utilization of the American nuclear weapon is the President of the United States. Even the German Chancellor or Japanese Prime Minister or some other countries' leaders would be consulted. But these leaders would not have, of course, they don't have any power to decide whether US uses nuclear weapon or not. So that's why the shared or combined planning is very limited. This is another argument. So finally, we are not necessarily reach a consensus. So the consensus is we need to strengthen the software procedure like solution within the alliance. But how to and in what time frame is we had multiple views on that. So do you have something to add to that?
No, I think you've given an excellent summary. I would just make one general point for the audience, and that's that this is a point of our discussion where we found that we had different concepts of the word plan. For the military participants in the group, planning means something very specific. And in the nuclear realm, it means knowing which weapon you're going to take from which supply depot and made up with which aircraft, which is going to be flown by which pilot, which is going to be refueled, where along the way by what aircraft, which is going to strike which target and return to which base. That's operational planning. And that is only shared with the states that participate in the operation so far. But planning for nuclear war, well, it means having a concept of how you think you can achieve whatever your objectives might be in a circumstance that's awful. And planning in that sense involves having concepts and policies and strategies and a theory of how you can make it turn out okay in the end. And so these two different meanings of the word planning, your line of argument very much attached to the operational level and usefully so. But there's this other dimension as well.
Correct. That's correct. So anyway, this issue should be continue to be discussed. I think between two sides of the Pacific. Maybe South Korea wants to join.
Right.
Yeah. And finally, I think slightly completely different topic. That is U.S. nuclear forces itself. And in the nuclear strategy, there's a new two targeting concept. That is, one is a counterforce, the other is counter value. And the counterforce implies to strike the adversary's nuclear forces. And the counter value is to strike adversaries' cities or economic infrastructure. So usually counterforce is more, more restrained, and counter value is more escalated. And ironically, when someone says nuclear deterrence strategy should be shifted to minimum deterrence, but minimum deterrence is counter value strategy. And to conduct counter force strike strategy, then you cannot be a minimum deterrence. That was described in the 2013 nuclear employment guidance, which was issued at the time of Obama administration. And we discussed counterforce. And especially when we have a too near peer, whether we should have counter force strike strategy or not was discussed. So I really impressed by that argument. So could you summarize that?
I can try. It was, as you know and recall, a wide-ranging discussion where we again discovered that people had different definitions for many of the main terms. But here our chief recommendation to deal with these 300 new missile silos in China is to deploy some additional U.S. nuclear weapons to put them at risk. The opponents of this recommendation say there's no point in doing that. That putting those targets at risk, well, if there's a big nuclear war, they're going to be empty silos because the weapons will already have been fired at us. Or they just don't believe that we could credibly limit damage to the United States or our allies by striking at these forces. So some would argue we shouldn't respond to China's nuclear buildup in any way. And for the group, this didn't make much sense because not because we have an old doctrine called counterforce that we have to stick to, but because the failure to respond in some way to China's nuclear buildup would be interpreted in Beijing and perhaps in Tokyo and perhaps other capitals as proof that the United States really isn't willing to compete with China as China goes for new military advantage and possibly nuclear superiority. And if we confirm the Chinese belief that we are a nation in decline and retreat, then nuclear deterrence and general deterrence are going to become even less reliable. So the argument we make in favor of counterforce deployments is really this political argument, not so much the employment argument. I want to say about this topic, we've a point that relates to many of the others, which is as a study group report, the report describes the areas of agreement that we could find on all of these topics, but it also describes where we couldn't find agreement and why. And we did this in order to assist people interested in becoming more knowledgeable about this topic to understand the elements of the debate and to do their own thinking about them.
Yep. I was very interested that when people said the reason why we may need counterforce strategy is just in case their leaders thought their nuclear force is very important. Mm-hmm. Because their leader put big value for that nuclear forces, then the American capability to hold that nuclear force at risk would have strong deterrence effect. Right. But if they don't, U.S. would not necessarily to have that kind of targeting philosophy. That was very interesting, I think. Right. I was very interested in that.
That's good.
Yeah. So maybe we covered all of the issue, almost all of the issue which we want to discuss. And do you have some other thing too?
Well, I just want to make the basic point that the purpose of this endeavor, this was a year-long project, was to try to frame the issues, draw attention to them, inform the discussion and raise the quality of discussion about the issues. We hope that government officials will reflect on our recommendations and implement them. They're unlikely to implement all of them. We tried to chart a middle course. One reaction to China's emergence as a nuclear peer would be to just say, we've entered a new arms race, arms control is dead, let's get on with it. Another reaction is to say, arms control is our first and primary and perhaps only goal, and we can accept a lot more risk in our nuclear deterrence posture, and we shouldn't respond to China's growth. We think both of these ideas are wrong. And so we tried to find a middle ground where there is an arms control solution on the table, which if Russia and China would sign up to, would be great. But assuming they don't, we have a plan to safeguard our interests and those of our allies that we're reluctant to implement because it involves increasing the number of nuclear weapons and spending more money in this area. But we won't be left vulnerable, and we won't be compelled to accept more risk in a deterrence posture that's somewhat eroded. And we hope that people find the report useful, and we look forward to being a part of a continuing conversation about it here in Japan and East Asia, but globally.
Right. So from Japanese perspective, now the attention to nuclear deterrence is getting higher and higher, and for apparent reason. At the same time, still, strategic debate, or the number of people who discuss is very highly strategic or highly philosophical debates on nuclear deterrence is limited. But we got huge benefit with contact with American community. So we want to continue that. And also, Russia-Ukraine war reminds us the importance of nuclear, not necessarily deterrence, the importance of nuclear shadow.
Right.
So we also need to continuously update the view of the nuclear deterrence, while the nuclear arsenal is very sometimes old. So we may find another novel situation in Korean Peninsula or Taiwan. So even at that case, the nuclear shadow would continue to affect. So let's continue to debate, and we will have, another big conference next week. That is April Strategic Weapon 21 in Washington D.C.
Right.
So I really like to join that in the continued debate between security provider side and the side to be reassured.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and let me say that in that framework, this report emphasizes something all of us in the group believe, but in general, I think Americans believe, which is that deterrence is now something that these alliances do together, the allies do together. It's not just something provided by the United States to an ally. And this shift in the way of thinking about this, U.S.-Japan alliance made already 15, 20 years ago. Other alliances are catching up. But we look forward as a research center to continuing to try to drive this debate forward. We go out of our way to ensure that we have the perspectives of European and Asian allies at our conference tables. And we look forward to being a part of your continuing discussion of these things. Thank you so much for doing this.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.